What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review Steven Spielberg's latest movie, The Fabelmans, which is in limited release this weekend, but will be opening wide next week. But this review is going to almost feel like it's got a bit of a personality crisis, because the emotions and the reaction that I had at the beginning of the movie, they're quite different from the emotions and the reaction I had at the end of the movie. And this is one of those movies that gets better and better, but like the first 30 or 40 minutes, how can I say this? I hated the movie so passionately and so intensely that I considered walking out of it entirely. But I'm thrilled that I stayed, because by the end, I was absolutely in love with it. And the final scene was so good. It was almost like Steven Spielberg were taking requests from the audience and said, James Hancock, how would you like me to finish this movie? And I was like, well, Mr. Spielberg, I would like it if you would capture this scene, this very popular story from your youth about the time you met a very famous filmmaker, one who I happen to like quite a bit. And so I don't know what to tell people, because nostalgic semi-autobiographical movies, that's always a tough nut to crack. It's a very difficult formula to nail. And it's not the story of Steven Spielberg, but it might as well be. But the character's name is Sammy Fabelman. And we track his early years in New Jersey to the time where his family moves to Arizona, to eventually his time in California, which culminates with him getting his first gig working in the movie biz. And I guess before I heap either praise or criticism on the movie, let me first just say a few words about Steven Spielberg, because my childhood was totally dominated by his influence. I mean, obviously, movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Temple of Doom and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I mean, these were major landmark movies that were like cultural hand grenades that had a huge influence over the movie business overall. And obviously, as a producer, he produced many other classics from my childhood as well. But I think it's no exaggeration to say that Steven Spielberg's generation, his peers, his friends, people like Francis Ford Coppola and Brian De Palma and George Lucas and Martin Scorsese, basically all the new Hollywood and film school generation cats from the late 60s to the late 70s, they basically saved the movie business. In the late 60s, there were a lot of signs on the wall that Hollywood was dying, where they really had lost touch with the audience. And they were still trying to make movies for an older generation that was staying home and watching TV. And if you look at some of the big budget disasters that lost a lot of money in the late 60s, kind of like right now, Hollywood was in a process of reinventing itself, grasping at straws, didn't know what worked anymore. And suddenly this new generation of talent came through and just reinvented genre filmmaking, reinvented the blockbuster. And I think the adventure of the young Spielberg on the set of Jaws, fighting the elements, fighting the schedule, fighting the budget, basically giving everything that his body had to give in terms of talent or physical resourcefulness or whatever the case might be. It's one of the great heroic tales of a young filmmaker just making a bona fide classic that nearly 50 years later is still beloved by many, many people. And movies like Jaws and movies like Star Wars and movies like Carrie, I mean, all these filmmakers, they basically postponed the death of the movie industry by a few decades. But even though Spielberg's not my favorite of that generation, here's what you have to keep in mind. If you look at the top 10 most popular movies ever in U.S. history in terms of like butts and seats, just pure raw ticket sales, when you adjust for inflation, he's got 2 of the top 10 most popular movies ever made. And that's just fucking insane. And that definitely makes him the most popular and beloved filmmaker of the last 50 years. He's a household name. And when people talk about the relative health of the movie industry, basically what you need in any era, whether you're talking about the earliest days in the silent films of like the 19-teens and the 1920s up to the present day, no matter how visionary and groundbreaking and artistically brave your filmmakers of that generation might be, you need hit makers. You need golden boys that can basically be the goose that lays the golden egg, that will keep the marketplace healthy and vital enough to create room for other filmmakers to experiment, etc. and so forth. But if you don't have myth makers and magic makers like Spielberg every generation, well, then that art form, whatever that art form might be, is going to suffer and shrink. So before I say anything negative, keep in mind that Spielberg made my childhood a much happier one. Basically, from the earliest days where I discovered his movies, seeing movies like E.T. in the theater and Raiders of the Lost Ark in the theater, up through about the time of Jurassic Park, it was a very fun, happy time to be a young movie fan. So with all that out of the way, let's start drifting into some of my complaints about this movie, which he co-wrote with Tony Kushner. And I think this movie works best when it's depicting what it's like to be a young child who's kind of torn between two parents and their values, one of whom is very interested in technology, one of whom is very interested in art and music, and how both of those influences play a massive role in turning this person into the young man that he eventually becomes. And there's a legitimate, infectious, contagious sense of joy and discovery as he's learning how to shoot 8mm film, learning how to edit 8mm film, learning how to employ certain rudimentary, very basic, almost prehistoric special effects in his movies that he's basically making with his friends in the Boy Scouts during his spare time. And then seeing the power of film when you project your creation in front of an audience and live with the response. Good, bad, everything in between. But this movie almost fetishistically captures that early technology that he was experimenting with as a boy in the 50s and in the 60s. And that was incredible. What drove me fucking crazy with this movie was the excessively sweet and almost nauseatingly sentimental depiction of his childhood. And once again, nostalgia is very tough to get right, in particular 50s nostalgia. But I feel like 50s nostalgia is easier to stomach when you have a little hint of darkness running through it. Like, look at something like Stand By Me, which is late 50s, 1960. But like they're threats. They're dogs that'll eat your balls. There are bullies that will fucking kill you. It's a dangerous world. Or even something like A Christmas Story, even though that's one of the best like 50s nostalgia movies ever made, it still has bullies and sadness and so on and so forth. But when it drifts into this almost overly romanticized or overly idealized depiction of that era, it gets tough to stomach. And the first words that come to mind to describe this first 30 or 40 minutes would be like cloying or saccharine, melodramatic, or just plain obvious. And one of the main root causes of this problem are two actors who I really admire. I love Michelle Williams. I love Paul Dano. They've given us many incredible performances over like the last 15 years. Some of the best performances of the last 15 years. But watching them in this movie, especially toward the beginning, it's overwrought. It's like acting with a capital A, like a young high school student when they're first discovering their craft and they're learning to project their voice to the back row of their high school theater, and it all just feels a little hyperbolic and over the top. And I just found it to be unendurable, especially when they both use these kind of mannered affectations or this type of speech that sounds incredibly inauthentic. And I just wanted to say, like, the camera's right here. It's like 3 inches from your face. Calm down, settle down. Like, I mean, there are times where Michelle Williams comes across as this like hysterical, shrill gargoyle, and I could not take it. And Paul Dano's slightly more endurable, but just by a hair. And so, like I said, I almost walked out of the movie in the first 30 or 40 minutes. I could not stand what I was watching. And don't even get me started on Seth Rogen, who manages to butcher just about every single scene in which he appears. If I never hear Seth Rogen's voice again, it'll be soon enough. He is the definition. He's the poster child of overexposure. I've seen him too many times. And back in like the aughts, or basically from like Freaks and Geeks up through maybe like Steve Jobs, he did give us a lot of performances that I enjoyed, but I've had enough of Seth Rogen for 10 lifetimes. But thank God for Judd Hirsch, because not only has he given us many, many decades of incredible performances, but there comes a point in the movie where he steps onto the stage and injects some much-needed life and some much-needed conflict and some much-needed kind of insight and philosophy into the film. And he's basically one of those crazy relatives who went off to join the circus a long time ago and has given everything to his art, to his craft, as opposed to family and domesticity and that sort of thing. But he has this incredible scene where he sits down with the young Steven Spielberg, or the young Sam Fabelman, as they call him in the film. And he basically calls out the young Sammy on being an obsessive personality, somebody who's going to give everything to his craft. And while Sam might love his parents, might love his sisters, and might love his family, basically the character played by Judd Hirsch recognizes that Sam is one of those people where their art and their craft is like a drug. And if they don't get a regular fix, well, then something horrible will happen. But he can just tell that he is completely, totally obsessed with storytelling, as in particular, the technology that is employed for the craft of filmmaking. How do you get the emotions that you're trying to convey onto the screen? What technique is required? And it was a really powerful scene. And Judd Hirsch, I mean, he is just a national treasure at this point. And when he dies, it'll be a very sad day for filmmaking and TV, etc., and so forth. But that was the real turning point. Then suddenly the movie finds a completely different gear. And I have to admit that I was not initially sold on Gabrielle LaBelle, who plays the teen version of Sam as opposed to the young child. But initially, he's so wooden and so reserved and so stiff and just such a non-person in many ways. It almost seemed like everybody was overacting around him just to try to inject some life back into these scenes or to kind of overcompensate for the fact that he just wasn't emoting at all. But then when they moved to California and suddenly Sam is in a high school where he's the only Jewish kid and he's faced with a lot of anti-Semitism and he starts getting his early kind of clumsy experiences in the world of love and romance and sex, etc., and basically learning how to win over his classmates through the power of his craft, the movie stops being sentimental and nostalgic and just becomes a really good movie about a teenager. And I think that was the critical creative mistake from my point of view toward the opening, is that Spielberg made his life so overly romantic and so overly glowing and nostalgic that it abandons anything resembling reality, whereas the experiences that Sam goes through in high school are really intense. I mean, he's getting beat up at school. He's got really hot girls who are trying to, like, almost quite literally breathe the power of Jesus in through his mouth. I mean, it's fucking hysterical and it's sad and it's dramatic. And on the home front, his parents are going through a divorce. And suddenly the movie discovers a feeling of authenticity that was totally eluding the film in the first 30, 40 minutes. And there's one scene that's particularly good during the high school prom where he gets to show this movie of his entire class during a day at the beach. And he does something really special where he depicts one of the major bullies who's been tormenting him in a really heroic fashion, whether he's winning at races or playing volleyball. But he basically, through the power of film, makes this guy seem like the world's biggest badass. And the bully doesn't know how to take it. And he confronts Sam, and they're sitting outside in the hallway, and he's like, why would you do that? I've been nothing but a complete and total shit to you. Like, how dare you portray me in that way, where, like, he's portrayed in such a larger-than-life fashion that his ex-girlfriend who hates him ends up falling back in love with him. I mean, it's a great scene about the power of movies and the conflicting emotions that the audience can feel. And it's one of the best dramatic scenes that Spielberg has given us in many, many years. I just loved it. And that would have been enough for me to give this movie a favorable review. But then Spielberg, that son of a bitch, gives us a final scene where we see the young Sam going to Hollywood, going through his first job interview. And at the end of the interview, the guy's like, well, Hollywood's greatest director who ever lived. He's got an office across the hallway. Why don't you go in there and maybe, if you're lucky, he'll sit down and talk with you for a couple minutes. And I'd heard the story spoken by Steven Spielberg in the documentary directed by John Ford about how, like, age 18 or 19, he found himself sitting opposite a man who had given Hollywood many of his most beloved films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, movies like Stagecoach, The Informer, Fort Apache, How Green Was My Valley, Grapes of Wrath, The Searchers, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. I mean, that was a major influence on the young Spielberg. And so I knew the story, but to add icing on the cake, they bring in goddamn David Lynch, one of my favorite living directors, to play John Ford. And I had no idea that I needed to see David Lynch portray John Ford on film. But as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh my God, like, of course, this completely makes sense. And there's this moment before David Lynch walks in where young Sam is looking around the office and looking at all the movie posters, and we hear the theme music to The Searchers kick in. And I've seen The Searchers many times. I did a giant podcast about it on Wrong Reel, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes below. But I almost started crying. It was such a powerful scene about, I mean, Spielberg at this point is a very old filmmaker, but to see him remembering what it was like to be a young, like, movie fanatic, getting a chance to meet one of his heroes, and then David Lynch comes in, starts lighting cigars and talking smack and giving him a lesson about where the horizon line should be, and when you're framing a shot, whether it should be at the top or at the bottom, and what the differences are, and so on and so forth. But for movie lovers, particularly movie lovers who love John Ford and who love David Lynch, two very different filmmakers from two very different generations, but both of whom represent the best that movies have to offer, The scene really won me over, and I was like, God damn you, Spielberg, you're going to make me regret all the hateful feelings I was experiencing in the early part of the movie. And what's incredible to me is that Steven Spielberg, who's nearly 76 years old, still feels compelled to express his love of the medium of film with so much passion, with so much intensity. This guy, he could have retired a long time ago. He said all he needed to say a long time ago. He's given so much to this art of film, the business of film, in terms of the movies he's directed, the movies he's produced, being an ambassador for the history of film. He's given everything that one can give to this medium, and yet he still felt compelled to create this incredible declaration of love to the art and power and history of movies. And one would think that one could infer all this love and passion through all of his best movies. And it's incredible that at age 76, he still feels that drive. He's still getting the fix from the drug that the character of Judd Hirsch describes in the film. And it was just an incredible articulation or like distillation of what drives movie lovers, whether they write movies, film movies, or just work as like a grip or an electric or a production assistant, or whatever the case might be. Not everybody in the movie industry feels that love and passion, but it was incredibly refreshing seeing somebody who has every right to be bitter and jaded or just kind of disconnected at this point, that he still feels that incredible personal connection to the art of film. So I found that to be incredibly inspiring. So the big question is, how does this movie compare to his recent output or his classics? And for people who are of a certain age, basically like 50 down to like 35, everybody's going to give you different answers about what his best work might be. But obviously for me, I'm going to say basically from like 1975 or even 1971 with Duel, but really Jaws to Jurassic Park, 1975 to 1993. That was the magic. That was the real heart and soul of what defines his career. But he has made good movies in recent years. I've not seen all of his movies in recent years, but for every movie like Bridge of Spies, which I really loved back in 2015, he'll make a movie like Ready Player One, which I fucking despise. I thought Ready Player One was just a soulless cash grab enterprise, totally devoid of any heart or feeling, and I really intensely despised it. So much so that I skipped West Side Story, and apparently I made a huge mistake because I've heard author Bret Easton Ellis and filmmaker Quentin Tarantino both talking about how West Side Story is one of the best cinematic experiences to be seen on the big screen in recent years. But I'm just glancing at his 58 directing credits on IMDb, and would I say The Fabelmans is better than Lincoln? I liked it better than Lincoln, even though I feel like Lincoln's more consistent. The Fabelmans has this incredible second half. Did I like it better than Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull? Absolutely. I fucking hated Crystal Skull. Did I like it better than Munich? Munich's much more, I guess, political, but equally personal in a lot of ways. It's probably maybe on that level. I'd say it's better than like Catch Me If You Can. I liked it better than Minority Report. I liked it better than AI, Artificial Intelligence. It's not as good as Saving Private Ryan, but definitely better than the Jurassic World sequel. Is it better than or worse than Schindler's List? Oof. That's hard to say. I'll table that, but yeah, it's maybe better than Hook. But now we start getting into the films of my childhood, movies like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Empire of the Sun, and movies that I saw many times over. So it's almost impossible for me to draw a comparison between that great early period and now. But it's incredible to me that he's still got it, age 76. And there are not many filmmakers of his age that still got it. Like Martin Scorsese, still going strong. Ridley Scott, more or less, is still going strong. Clint Eastwood is in his 90s, still making movies. I don't know if he's going strong, but he's still around. Paul Verhoeven, still going strong. George Miller's a little younger, but he's still at it, still cranking out movies. So some of these old dinosaurs from the 60s and 70s are still around, still doing it, but very few of them are still doing it at the top of their game. And I'm not going to say that The Fabelmans is the top of Spielberg's game, but there are times where it feels like he is. So yeah, his talent is still completely, totally intact. And the last thing I want to say about Spielberg, and this is totally unrelated to The Fabelmans, but it gets back to his love of and obsession with film. But I'll never forget think it was on the DVD of Eyes Wide Shut, where you had a bunch of testimonials by actors, directors, so on and so forth, people talking about what it meant to them when they heard that Stanley Kubrick had died. And Stanley Kubrick was a filmmaker that Spielberg really looked up to. And one of the most moving things I ever heard a filmmaker say about another filmmaker was how when Spielberg heard that Kubrick died, I think he was at a dinner party or people were over at his house, and he screened for them the last scene of Paths of Glory, which is one of the most powerful scenes of Kubrick's career. But I was, at the time, I remember thinking, God damn, like, what an amazing tribute to a great director. Like, when you hear they've moved on to show a scene of enormous emotional power to your closest friends and family members who are around you. And once again, that really gets back to what is the essence of loving movies and or making movies. And so Spielberg, he represents the best that filmmaking has to offer, even if I might prefer the films of Brian De Palma or I might prefer the films of Martin Scorsese from that whole generation. But Spielberg is movies, and probably the most important figure for the health of the industry of the last 50 years. So I'm going to make myself start crying if I keep going on any further. So go see The Fabelmans and make up your own mind. But before I wrap up, the holidays are right around the corner, and I need to bring you a word from Manscaped, the official sponsor of my podcast, Strong Reels. So this holiday season, I'll be giving thanks to our friends over at Manscaped. Everyone loves turkey and stuffing, but you'll be looking like dessert with the help of Manscaped's Performance Package 4.0. The leaders in below-the-waist grooming have blessed you with the ultimate Thanksgiving dinner topic. Tell your in-laws about your new cutting-edge ball trimmer and gift yourself or the man in your life the ultimate men's hygiene bundle. Trim your pumpkins by going to manscaped.com and using the discount code WRONGREEL in all caps for free shipping and 20% off. Inside that kit, you'll find the Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer, Weed Whacker ear and nose hair trimmer, Crop Reviver toner, Crop Preserver ball deodorant, Performance Boxer briefs, and a travel bag to hold your goodies. Think of it as a cornucopia for your balls. So on that note, I'm wrapping this fucker up. Hope you enjoyed this review. If so, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell. And if you want to talk more about Spielberg, hunt me down on Twitter @GeekinOut. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.